So during this module, we'll be talking about effective questions. So think ahead to the interview that you'll have later in the semester and ask yourself, who will you interview? What kind of questions will you be asking them? Consider what you want to know about the person. What kind of a relationship do you have? So you'll know a little bit about the boundaries in asking the questions. So first, let's tackle the questions that you do want to ask. So ask open-ended questions. Open-ended questions, as you know from Module 1, can't be answered in just a few short words. So an open question isn't, do you live in Denton? Instead, it would be, tell me about where you live. That's the difference between closed and open. Then ask questions that are pertinent to the reason for the interview, the person that you're meeting. If, for instance, if you were interviewing your mom, you would ask an entirely different set of questions than if you're interviewing a professional that's in the field you hope to someday go into. Also, ask questions that build on the previous. So you want to ask a question about a person's career path. You may start with, tell me about how you got into this field. The next question, you don't want to say, tell me about your childhood. Those don't correspond with one another at all. And often a person's response to the question we ask will give us some ideas for follow-up questions that we may not have even previously written or scripted. So also feel free to kind of go off script a little bit. The next thing that you want to do is to ask only one question at a time. Just one. Often people don't remember whenever you ask them a series of questions, or they only answer one of the questions anyway. And anytime that you have a 2 or 3 part question, you can always build that into one question if it has to be that way, or you can just break it down and ask them in separate questions. You do have to ask 5 questions in the interview, but you can ask as many as you want. So it's okay if you go over the minimum amount required for the interview. Okay, so now let's address what to avoid. And this will just be a reiteration of what I talked about in what to ask. First, avoid the closed questions. So closed questions, again, they get yes or no answers. They're pretty black and white. You're asking someone basically an either or an or something that's very narrow. Avoid questions that start with why. I have an entire video about the reason to avoid questions that begin in why, because not all counseling professionals believe that we should avoid the term why. I can post that video on just if you want to delve a little bit more into that. But any question that starts with why, you can change it. So for instance, I said to you, I can talk a little bit about the reasons to avoid the question that begins with why, instead of saying why to avoid questions that begin with why. You can rephrase it and ask it in a different way. And if you just get in the habit of avoiding it to begin with, then you'll just naturally talk that way. I also encourage you today to read ahead, look at the interview, and look at all the requirement criteria. So if you have any questions to ask, you can do that now before you get into that assignment. It's the biggest assignment in the class. It has the most points and the most percentage value. So I want you to do well. And so look at it now. That way you can ask questions much earlier than the assignment is due.